Alexander the Great never lost a battle. He marched 10,000 miles, founded cities that still stand, and changed history forever. This is his entire story: the rise, the conquests, the glory, and the tragedy. If this sounds epic, hit like to show your support. Subscribe for the full narration. The story starts now. Chapter 1. Early life, education, and rise to power, 356 to 336 BCE. Alexander III, who would one day be called Alexander the Great, was born in July 356 BCE in Pella, the royal capital of the Kingdom of Macedon. Tradition places his birth on the 20th or 21st of the month, the same night the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. Later writers saw this as a sign. The goddess was away attending his birth, leaving her temple unprotected. From the very beginning, stories of destiny clung to him. His father was Philip II, the king who had transformed Macedon from a backward, divided northern land into the most powerful state in Greece. Philip had unified the Macedonian tribes through war, diplomacy, and marriage, created a professional standing army, and introduced the sarissa, a long pike 18 to 20 feet in length, that made the Macedonian phalanx nearly unbreakable. He had also reorganized the cavalry, the famous companions, into the decisive striking arm of his forces. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a princess of Epirus, daughter of Neoptolemus I, from a royal house that claimed descent from Achilles himself. Olympias was a woman of intense passion and deep religious devotion, particularly to the cult of Dionysus. Ancient writers describe her keeping snakes in her bed as part of ecstatic rites, and the court at Pella buzzed with rumors that Alexander's true father might have been a god, Zeus perhaps in the form of a serpent. Whatever the truth, these stories added to the aura of the supernatural that surrounded him from childhood. Alexander grew up in a world of palace intrigue, violence, and unrelenting ambition. Philip's many marriages produced rival half-siblings and competing factions. Alexander was raised alongside his full sister Cleopatra and half-brother Orhidius, who would later be known as Philip III. But the court was a dangerous place where alliances shifted and loyalties were constantly tested. Even as a boy, Alexander showed extraordinary qualities. He was fearless, quick-witted, and endlessly curious. One famous story tells how, at age 12 or 13, he tamed the wild horse Bucephalus, a massive, uncontrollable stallion no one else could ride. Alexander noticed the horse was afraid of its own shadow and turned it toward the sun, calming it instantly. He mounted and rode, earning his father's admiration. Philip is said to have told him, "My son, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." Philip recognized his son's potential early and spared no expense on his education. Around the age of 13, in 343 BCE, Alexander was sent to Mieza, a secluded grove near Pella, to study under Aristotle, the greatest philosopher alive. Aristotle, then in his early 40s, had been summoned from Athens by Philip himself. For 3 years he tutored Alexander and a small circle of noble Macedonian youths, including Ptolemy, Hephaestion, and Nearchus. The curriculum was vast: philosophy, ethics, politics, literature, especially Homer, whose Iliad Alexander kept under his pillow, medicine, geography, and natural sciences. Aristotle taught him to value Greek culture above all others, yet also to respect the wisdom of other peoples. These lessons shaped Alexander's later vision of a world united under Hellenic civilization, though he would often go far beyond what his teacher considered wise or prudent. At the same time, Alexander was trained in the harsh Macedonian royal page system. Young noblemen served the king personally, tended his horses, guarded his sleep, and learned the arts of war through constant hunting and drills. These years forged him into an exceptional horseman, warrior, and leader, capable of enduring the same hardships as his men. By his late teens, Alexander was already proving himself in battle. In 338 BCE, at the age of 18, He commanded the left wing of Philip's army at the Battle of Chaeronea against the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Leading the decisive cavalry charge, he broke the famous sacred band of Thebes, securing Philip's victory and Macedonian supremacy over Greece. Philip honored him by allowing him to be the first to strike the enemy line, and later entrusted him with negotiating with the defeated Athenians. Alexander's skill, courage, and charisma were already legendary. But the relationship between father and son grew strained. Philip's marriage to Cleopatra, niece of General Achilles, in 337 BCE produced a legitimate heir, threatening Alexander's position. Olympias and Alexander withdrew to Epirus amid rumors of plots. The court was rife with suspicion and division. In October 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated at Aegae during his daughter's wedding. The killer, Pausanias, a former royal bodyguard, was cut down almost immediately, but the motive remains unclear. Some ancient writers hint at Olympias' involvement, others suggest Persian agents or disaffected nobles. Whatever the truth, the kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse. Alexander moved with terrifying speed. The army assembly acclaimed him king within hours. He executed potential rivals, Attalus in Asia Minor, Carinus the Infant, and several nobles suspected of disloyalty. Yet he also showed shrewd generosity, honoring Philip's veterans, promising the Persian campaign would continue, and keeping the existing command structure. The swift elimination of threats and the promise of continuity steadied the kingdom. By the spring of 335 BCE, Alexander had already begun the work of consolidation that would carry him into Asia. At 20 years old, he had inherited a throne, crushed immediate opposition, and prepared to lead the greatest expedition in Greek history. Chapter 2: Consolidation of Greece and the Balkans, 336 to 334 BCE. When Philip II fell dead at Aegae in October 336 BCE, stabbed by his own bodyguard during the wedding celebrations of his daughter Cleopatra, the Macedonian kingdom stood on the edge of chaos. Philip had transformed a fractured northern Greek state into a dominant power, but his empire was still new, held together by fear, loyalty, and his own commanding presence. At 20 years old, Alexander III inherited a throne that many believed would collapse under him. The nobility whispered, the army watched, and the Greek city-states waited for the first sign of weakness. Alexander acted with terrifying speed. He summoned the Macedonian assembly, the army itself acting as the political body, and was acclaimed king as Alexander III within hours of his father's death. He moved immediately to eliminate any possible rival. Attalus, Philip's uncle by marriage and commander of the advance force in Asia Minor, was executed on suspicion of disloyalty. Philip's infant son Carinus, born to his last wife Cleopatra, was quietly killed. Several noblemen suspected of plotting were arrested and executed. The message was unmistakable: Alexander would tolerate no challenge. Yet he also showed shrewd generosity. He honored the veterans of Philip's campaigns, promised continuation of the planned war against Persia, and kept the existing command structure intact. These gestures steadied the army and the nobility. With Macedonia secured, Alexander turned to the greater threat. The Greek city-states, long resentful of Macedonian domination, now saw an opportunity. In the spring of 335 BCE, Athens, Thebes, and other cities began to stir. Demosthenes, the great Athenian orator, denounced Alexander as a mere boy and urged open rebellion. The Thebans, emboldened, expelled the Macedonian garrison Philip had stationed in their citadel and fortified the city. Alexander responded with a speed that stunned the Greeks. He marched south through Thessaly, securing its allegiance along the way, and reached Thebes in a matter of days. The siege was brief but merciless. After a short resistance, Alexander stormed the walls. The city was sacked with exemplary brutality, 6,000 Thebans killed, 30,000 enslaved and sold across the Greek world. Every building was razed to the ground, except the house of the poet Pindar and the temples. Survivors were scattered, and the name of Thebes was nearly erased from the map. The destruction sent a shockwave through Greece. No one doubted that the new king would crush rebellion, with the same ruthlessness his father had used to build the empire. Athens, terrified by the fate of Thebes, sent an embassy of apology. Alexander demanded the surrender of anti-Macedonian leaders, including Demosthenes, but eventually accepted a compromise, pardoning most. Sparta, ever proud and isolationist, refused to join the League of Corinth but posed no immediate threat. By late 335 BCE, Greece was subdued. The League of Corinth, originally created by Philip, renewed its alliance with Alexander as hegemon, granting him supreme command of the Pan-Hellenic War against Persia. With his southern flank secure, Alexander turned north to protect his Balkan frontier against the Illyrians, Triballi, and Thracians, tribes that had always threatened Macedonia's borders. In the spring and summer of 335 BCE, he conducted a lightning campaign. He defeated the Triballi in a series of sharp engagements along the Danube. He crossed the river itself to demonstrate Macedonian power. He crushed an Illyrian invasion led by King Glaucius. These northern operations showcased Alexander's tactical brilliance, rapid forced marches, combined arms coordination of phalanx and cavalry, and personal leadership in battle. The frontier was pacified, freeing him to focus entirely on the Persian invasion. By early 334 BCE, Alexander had consolidated his position. He assembled his invasion army, the core Macedonian phalanx of 12,000 men armed with the long sarissa, the elite companion cavalry of 1,800 heavy horsemen, Thessalian and Thracian allies, and contingents from the Greek cities. The total force numbered around 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, supported by engineers, siege train, and a supply corps. Financially strained, Philip's treasury was nearly empty. Alexander relied on plunder and Persian wealth to sustain the campaign. In May 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia. He sacrificed to the gods at Troy, took soil from Ilion as a link to Achilles, and visited the tomb of Protesilaus, the first Greek to die at Troy. These symbolic acts tied his campaign to the epic past and to the idea of Pan-Hellenic revenge. At 22 years old, Alexander stood on the shore of Asia, ready to challenge the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Chapter 3. Invasion of Asia Minor and Early Persian Victories, 334 to 333 BCE. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander III led his army across the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. This was no ordinary crossing. The army numbered about 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, the largest force any Greek leader had ever assembled against Persia. Alexander left Antipater behind as regent in Macedonia with 12,000 men to hold the homeland. As he stepped onto Asian soil, he cast his spear into the ground, claiming the continent by right of conquest, and sacrificed to the gods at the site of ancient Troy. He visited the tomb of Achilles, took soil from Ilion, and left a wreath in honor of the hero whose blood, he believed, ran in his veins through his mother Olympia's. These acts were deliberate. Alexander framed his campaign as a Pan-Hellenic war of revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece more than a century earlier. The Persian Empire under Darius III was the greatest power on earth, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, with seemingly endless resources and a professional army. Yet the satraps of Western Asia Minor were divided, slow to coordinate, and still reeling from Philip's earlier preparations. Darius himself, secure in distant Susa, underestimated the young king who had only recently taken the throne. The first clash came at the Granicus River in May 334 BCE. The Persian satraps had gathered a force of perhaps 10 to 20,000 cavalry and 5 to 10,000 Greek mercenaries under Memnon of Rhodes, one of the most capable commanders in Persian service. They positioned themselves on the eastern bank of the river, using the water as a natural defense, with cavalry massed near the bank and infantry behind. Alexander arrived in the afternoon. His senior officers, including Parmenion, advised caution, wait until morning, cross at a safer ford, avoid risking the king in the first battle. Alexander refused. He believed delay would embolden the Persians and sap his own army's momentum. He ordered an immediate assault. The companion cavalry, with Alexander himself in the lead, charged across the shallow river at an angle, fighting their way up the muddy bank under a storm of javelins and arrows. Alexander fought in the front line, his helmet split by a Persian axe in one of the closest calls of his life. The phalanx followed, locking shields and pushing forward in a wedge to protect the crossing. The battle was short, fierce, and chaotic. The Persian cavalry crumbled under the Macedonian assault. Many satraps were killed, and the Greek mercenaries were surrounded. When the dust settled, Alexander spared most of the Greek prisoners, enslaving them as traitors to the Panhellenic cause. He sent 300 suits of Persian armor to Athens with the inscription, "From Alexander, son of Philip and the Greeks of Asia, except the Spartans to the Athenians." Macedonian losses were light, perhaps 100 dead, while the Persians suffered thousands. The victory at Granicus opened Western Asia Minor. Alexander marched south along the coast, liberating the Greek cities of Ionia. Most surrendered willingly, their populations weary of Persian rule. He exempted them from tribute, restored their autonomy, and often replaced pro-Persian oligarchies with democratic governments. The policy won him widespread support among the Greek communities of Asia. Miletus, a major port, resisted briefly. Alexander blockaded the harbor with his fleet and stormed the walls after a short siege. He pardoned the citizens but executed the Persian garrison. The capture gave him a vital naval base and supply point. The next challenge was Halicarnassus, a heavily fortified coastal city under the command of Memnon of Rhodes. The Persians had strengthened the walls and double harbors. Alexander besieged it for weeks, building siege towers and ramps, personally leading assaults under heavy fire. The fighting was brutal, but eventually the defenders withdrew to the citadel and nearby islands. Alexander razed the outer walls but spared the city itself. Memnon escaped by sea, continuing to harass Alexander's rear with guerrilla tactics. With Halicarnassus neutralized, Alexander disbanded most of his own fleet, keeping only a small squadron, saving money and forcing his army to advance inland. He wintered in Lycia and Phrygia, securing the southern coast and receiving reinforcements from Greece. In spring 333 BCE, he reached Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia. There stood the legendary chariot of Gordius, tied with an intricate knot. An oracle had declared that whoever undid the knot would rule Asia. Alexander, impatient with complexity, drew his sword and cut the knot in a single stroke, or, according to some accounts, pulled out the peg that held it. The act was hailed as a sign of his destiny and became one of the most famous stories of his life. Darius III now took personal command. He assembled a massive army, estimates vary from 60,000 to over 100,000, and marched to intercept Alexander near the narrow coastal plain of Issus. Alexander, outnumbered but confident in his disciplined troops, advanced north. The two armies met at the Pinaris River in November 333 BCE. Darius positioned his best troops, Greek mercenaries and Persian infantry, in the center, with cavalry on the wings. Alexander deployed his phalanx in the center, the companion cavalry on the right with himself in command, and Parmenion holding the left with the Thessalian cavalry. The battle was fierce. Alexander charged the Persian left with the companions, routing it. The phalanx locked shields and pushed forward against the Greek mercenaries in brutal hand-to-hand combat. When Darius saw his center collapsing, he fled the field, once again abandoning his army. His mother, wife, and children were captured in the royal camp. Alexander pursued briefly, then returned to relieve Parmenion on the left. By nightfall, the victory was complete. Tens of thousands of Persians lay dead. Macedonian losses were around 500. Alexander treated Darius's family with extraordinary respect. He sent word to the queen mother Sisygambis, "Your son is still king." The gesture won him admiration even among his enemies. With the western satrapies broken and the Persian fleet crippled, Alexander had cleared the path to the heart of the empire. Chapter 4: Conquest of Egypt and the Founding of Alexandria, 332 to 331 BCE. After the shattering victory at Issus in November 333 BCE, Alexander III stood on the threshold of a choice that would define the rest of his campaign. Darius III had fled eastward, abandoning his family, his camp, and the western provinces of his empire. Many of Alexander's senior commanders, Parmenion foremost among them, pressed him to pursue the Persian king immediately, believing one swift chase could end the war before winter set in. But Alexander saw a greater danger. The Persian navy still ruled the eastern Mediterranean, and any delay in securing the coast could allow the fleet to strike at his supply lines, incite rebellion in Greece, or cut him off from reinforcements. Rather than chase a fleeing king across endless plains, he chose to strike at the roots of Persian sea power. He turned the army south along the Levanten coast, determined to capture every port and leave the Persian fleet no refuge. The Phoenician cities, long weary of Persian domination, began to open their gates one by one. Arwad, Byblos, and Sidon surrendered peacefully, their rulers offering ships, supplies, and allegiance in exchange for local autonomy. Alexander accepted their submission graciously, appointing native leaders as satraps under Macedonian supervision, a policy that quickly earned him allies among peoples tired of heavy tribute and foreign governors. The first true challenge came at Tyre, the proud island city whose double harbors, towering walls, and centuries of independence had made it a legend of impregnability. Tyre refused to surrender. Alexander, unwilling to leave such a strategic fortress in his rear, began one of the most remarkable sieges in the history of warfare. From January to July 332 BCE, his engineers performed a feat that still astonishes. They constructed a massive mole, a causeway more than a kilometer long, using timber, stone, rubble, and the very ruins of the old mainland city, laboring under constant arrow fire and sorties from the Tyrian navy. The Tyrians fought back with fire ships, boiling sand, and counter towers, but Alexander's determination never faltered. He personally led assaults, often exposing himself to danger, and when the mole was finally complete, his siege engines rolled forward. The walls were breached, the city stormed. The fall of Tyre was brutal. 8,000 Tyrians died in the fighting, 30,000 were enslaved, and Alexander crucified 2,000 survivors along the shore as a grim warning to other cities. Yet he spared those who had surrendered early, allowed the city to be rebuilt, and showed mercy to the survivors who had sought refuge in the temples. The capture of Tyre broke Persian naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean and opened the entire coast to Alexander's control. Gaza held out next, its hilltop fortress fiercely defended by its Arab and Persian garrison. Alexander besieged it for 2 months, personally leading the final assault and taking an arrow wound to the shoulder. When Gaza fell, its governor Bitides was dragged behind Alexander's chariot in a deliberate echo of Achilles dragging Hector, a gesture both triumphant and chilling. With the coast now entirely in his hands, Alexander marched into Egypt in late 332 BCE. The Persian satrap Mazaces surrendered without a fight. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian rule since Cambyses' conquest in 525 BCE, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh in a traditional ceremony, sacrificing to the sacred Apis bull and honoring the local gods with reverence. He presented himself as the rightful successor to the ancient pharaohs, a role he embraced with genuine respect for Egyptian religion and culture. Near the Nile Delta, on the site of the old village of Rhacodes, he founded the first of many cities to bear his name, Alexandria. This new city was planned with a grid of broad streets, a magnificent harbor, and a mixed population of Greeks, Macedonians, Egyptians, and Jews. It would grow into one of the greatest centers of learning, trade, and culture in the ancient world. In early 331 BCE, Alexander led a small expedition across the desert to the remote oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis. The journey was punishing: sandstorms, thirst, and scorching heat, but legend says miraculous rain saved the army. At Siwa, the priest greeted Alexander as son of Zeus, Ammon being the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. Alexander never revealed the full prophecy, but from that moment he accepted divine status, styling himself son of Zeus Ammon. The visit gave him legitimacy in both Greek and Egyptian eyes, and deepened his belief in his own extraordinary destiny. Alexander spent several months organizing Egypt. He appointed Cleomenes of Naucratis as financial administrator, restored temples, and left only a small garrison, trusting the local population to remain loyal. With Egypt secure and providing grain, wealth, and recruits, he received reinforcements from Greece and prepared to strike at the heart of Persia. Darius III had used the time to assemble the largest army of his reign. Estimates range from 100,000 to 250,000 men, including the elite immortals, heavy cavalry from the eastern satrapies, scythed chariots, and even a few war elephants. He chose the broad plain of Gaugamela near modern Mosul in Iraq as the battlefield, leveling the ground to maximize his numerical advantage. Alexander advanced cautiously, arriving at Gaugamela in late September 331 BCE. On October 1, the two armies faced each other. Outnumbered perhaps 5-1, Alexander deployed his phalanx in the center, the companion cavalry on the right with himself in command, and Parmenion holding the left with the Thessalian cavalry. Behind the main line he placed a reserve to protect against encirclement. The battle began with Alexander ordering a diagonal advance to the right, forcing Darius to shift his left wing and creating a dangerous gap in the Persian center. Alexander saw the opening and struck. The companions charged through the gap in a thunderous wedge, smashing into Darius's bodyguard. At the same time, the phalanx locked shields and advanced, pinning the Persian infantry. Darius panicked and fled the field, again abandoning his army as he had at Issus. The Persian line collapsed. Alexander pursued briefly but returned to relieve Parmenion, who was hard-pressed on the left. By nightfall, the victory was complete. Tens of thousands of Persians lay dead. Macedonian losses were remarkably light, perhaps 500. With Darius in flight and his army shattered, Alexander marched unopposed into Babylon. The city surrendered in triumph. Alexander was welcomed as liberator. He restored the great temples, including Esagila, to Marduk, and appointed Mazius, a Persian noble who had surrendered at Gaugamela, as satrap. Next came Susa, the administrative capital of the empire. The city opened its gates, and Alexander captured vast treasuries, 50,000 talents of silver alone. He released Greek hostages taken during Xerxes's invasion in 480 BCE and held celebrations that blended Greek and Persian customs. In January 330 BCE, Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid kings. The palace complex was filled with unimaginable wealth. After weeks of feasting, the palace was burned. Ancient sources disagree on the cause. Some say it was deliberate revenge for Xerxes's burning of Athens. Others claim it began accidentally during a drunken revelry involving the courtesan Thais. Whatever the truth, the flames consumed the greatest symbol of Persian imperial might, marking the symbolic end of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius III, still fleeing eastward, was betrayed and murdered by his own satrap Bessus in July 330 BCE. Alexander found the body, gave it royal funeral rites, and sent it to Persepolis for burial. With Darius dead, Alexander declared himself king of Asia, assuming the full titles and ceremonies of the Persian kings. Chapter 5. The Heart of the Persian Empire, Gaugamela and Persepolis, 331 to 330 BCE. After the hard-won victory at Issus in November 333 BCE, Alexander III stood at a crossroads. Darius III had fled eastward, leaving behind his family, his camp, and the western satrapies of his vast empire. Many of Alexander's senior officers, Parmenian chief among them, urged an immediate pursuit, believing one final chase could end the war before winter. But Alexander saw the larger picture. The Persian navy still dominated the eastern Mediterranean, and any delay in securing the coast could allow revolts in Greece or raids on his supply lines. Instead of chasing shadows across the plains of Asia, he chose to strike at the roots of Persian sea power. He turned south along the Levanten coast, determined to capture every port and deny the Persian fleet any safe harbor. The Phoenician cities, long under Persian rule, began to surrender one by one. Arwad, Byblos, and Sidon opened their gates without a fight, their rulers offering ships and supplies in exchange for autonomy. Alexander accepted their submission, appointing local leaders as satraps under Macedonian oversight, a policy that quickly won him allies among the coastal peoples weary of Persian taxation. The first true obstacle was Tyre, the proud island city-state whose double harbors and towering walls had made it a legend of impregnability. Tyre refused to surrender. Alexander, refusing to bypass such a strategic fortress, began one of the most extraordinary sieges in military history. For 7 months, from January to July 332 BCE, his engineers labored to connect the island to the mainland. They built a massive mole, a causeway over a kilometer long, using timber, stone, rubble, and the very ruins of the old mainland city. The Tyrians fought back with fire ships, boiling sand, and counter-towers, but Alexander's determination never wavered. He personally led assaults, often under heavy arrow fire, and when the mole was finally complete, his siege engines rolled forward. The walls were breached, the city stormed, and Tyre fell. The aftermath was brutal. 8,000 Tyrians perished in the fighting, 30,000 were enslaved, and Alexander crucified 2,000 survivors along the shore as a grim warning to other cities. Yet he spared those who had surrendered early and allowed the city to be rebuilt. The fall of Tyre shattered Persian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean and opened the way south. Gaza held out next, its hilltop fortress fiercely defended. Alexander besieged it for 2 months, personally leading the final assault and taking an arrow wound to the shoulder. When Gaza fell, its governor Bitides was dragged behind Alexander's chariot in a deliberate echo of Achilles dragging Hector, a gesture both triumphant and chilling. With the entire coast now secure, Alexander marched into Egypt in late 332 BCE. The Persian satrap Mazaces surrendered without resistance. The Egyptians, long resentful of Persian rule since Cambyses' conquest in 525 BCE, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh in a traditional ceremony, sacrificing to the sacred Apis bull and honoring the local gods. He founded the first of his many Alexandrias near the Nile Delta, on the site of the old village of Rhacodes. This new city, with its grid plan, harbor, and mixed Greek-Egyptian population, would grow into one of the greatest centers of the ancient world. In early 331 BCE, Alexander led a small expedition across the desert to the remote oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis. The journey was punishing, sandstorms, thirst, and heat, but legend says miraculous rain saved the army. At Siwa, the priest greeted Alexander as son of Zeus, Ammon being the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. Alexander never revealed the full prophecy, but from that moment he accepted divine status, styling himself son of Zeus Ammon. The visit gave him legitimacy in both Greek and Egyptian eyes, and it deepened his belief in his own destiny. Alexander spent several months organizing Egypt. He appointed Cleomenes of Naucratis as financial administrator, restored temples, and left only a small garrison, trusting the local population to remain loyal. With Egypt secure, he received reinforcements from Greece and prepared to strike at the heart of Persia. Darius III had used the time to assemble the largest army of his reign. Estimates range from 100,000 to 250,000 men, including the elite immortals, heavy cavalry from the eastern satrapies, scythed chariots, and even a few war elephants. He chose the broad plain of Gaugamela near modern Mosul in Iraq as the battlefield, leveling the ground to maximize his numerical advantage. Alexander advanced cautiously, arriving at Gaugamela in late September 331 BCE. On October 1, the two armies faced each other. Outnumbered perhaps 5-1, Alexander deployed his phalanx in the center, the companion cavalry on the right with himself in command, and Parmenion holding the left with the Thessalian cavalry. Behind the main line he placed a reserve to protect against encirclement. The battle began with Alexander ordering a diagonal advance to the right, forcing Darius to shift his left wing and creating a dangerous gap in the Persian center. Alexander saw the opening and struck. The companions charged through the gap in a thunderous wedge, smashing into Darius's bodyguard. At the same time, the phalanx locked shields and advanced, pinning the Persian infantry. Darius panicked and fled the field, again abandoning his army as he had at Issus. The Persian line collapsed. Alexander pursued briefly but returned to relieve Parmenion, who was hard-pressed on the left. By nightfall, the victory was complete. Tens of thousands of Persians lay dead. Macedonian losses were remarkably light, perhaps 500. With Darius in flight and his army shattered, Alexander marched unopposed into Babylon. The city surrendered in triumph. Alexander was welcomed as liberator. He restored the great temples, including Esagila to Marduk, and appointed Mazius, a Persian noble who had surrendered at Gaugamela, as satrap. Next came Susa, the administrative capital of the empire. The city opened its gates, and Alexander captured vast treasuries, 50,000 talents of silver alone. He released Greek hostages taken during Xerxes's invasion in 480 BCE and held celebrations that blended Greek and Persian customs. In January 330 BCE, Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid kings. The palace complex was filled with unimaginable wealth. After weeks of feasting, the palace was burned. Ancient sources disagree on the cause. Some say it was deliberate revenge for Xerxes's burning of Athens. Others claim it began accidentally during a drunken revelry involving the courtesan Thais. Whatever the truth, the flames consumed the greatest symbol of Persian imperial might, marking the symbolic end of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius III, still fleeing eastward, was betrayed and murdered by his own satrap Bessus in July 330 BCE. Alexander found the body, gave it royal funeral rites, and sent it to Persepolis for burial. With Darius dead, Alexander declared himself King of Asia, assuming the full titles and ceremonies of the Persian kings. Chapter 6. Eastern Campaigns, Central Asia and Bactria, 330 to 327 BCE. After the murder of Darius III in the summer of 330 BCE, Alexander III proclaimed himself the legitimate heir to the Achaemenid throne. He began to adopt Persian royal customs, wearing the diadem, the Candace tunic, and accepting proskencies from Persian courtiers, though many Macedonians resisted the practice. These steps were not mere imitation. They were part of a deliberate policy to fuse Greek and Persian elements into a new imperial culture, winning the loyalty of the conquered while maintaining Macedonian dominance at the core. Yet the changes caused unease among his veteran companions, who saw them as a betrayal of their hard-won Greek identity. Alexander's immediate task was to hunt down Bessus, the satrap who had betrayed and killed Darius, proclaiming himself Artaxerxes V in Bactria. The pursuit took Alexander through the vast eastern satrapies of Parthia, Hyrcania, and Arya. He moved with relentless speed, covering hundreds of miles in weeks. In Parthia, he executed Nabarzanes and other conspirators who had surrendered. In Hyrcania, he reached the Caspian Sea. The first Greek to confirm it was a landlocked body of water. Bessus's support crumbled as local chiefs abandoned him, and by summer 329 BCE Alexander captured the usurper near the Oxus River. Bessus was stripped, had his ears and nose cut off in the Persian manner for regicide, and was sent to Ecbatana for public execution. Alexander then crucified him, declaring the act justice for Darius and a warning to any who would challenge his rule. With Bessus dead, the formal Persian resistance ended, but the eastern satrapies were far from subdued. Alexander spent the winter of 329 to 328 BCE in Zariaspa, modern Balkh, in Bactria, reorganizing his army and administration. He received reinforcements from Macedonia, including fresh phalanx troops and cavalry. He began training 30,000 Persian youths in Macedonian military discipline, the so-called epigoni, or successors, to create a new generation of troops loyal to him alone. He also married Roxana, the beautiful daughter of Oxyartes, a powerful Sogdian noble, in a lavish ceremony that blended Greek and Persian traditions. The marriage was both personal and political, securing the loyalty of local elites. But the real challenge came in Sogdia, modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, where Spitamenes, a skilled Sogdian noble, led a fierce guerrilla war. The region's vast steppes, rivers, and fortified towns made conventional conquest impossible. Alexander divided his army into smaller columns to cover more ground, built fortified cities, and conducted relentless patrols. Spitamenes ambushed isolated Macedonian detachments, inflicting heavy losses. Alexander responded with terror. Entire villages were razed, populations massacred, and survivors sold into slavery. In 328 BCE, Spitamenes was betrayed and killed by his own allies, who sent his head to Alexander in hopes of mercy. The rebellion collapsed, but the cost was enormous. Thousands of Macedonian lives lost to ambushes, disease, and exhaustion. Alexander founded several Alexandrias as military colonies, populating them with veterans, Greek settlers, and local women, creating lasting centers of Hellenic influence. The strain of the campaign showed in a tragic incident at Marikanda, Samarkand, in the autumn of 328 BCE. During a drunken banquet, Cleitus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions and the man who had saved his life at the Granicus, argued bitterly with the king. Cleitus accused Alexander of abandoning Macedonian ways for Persian luxury and favoritism. In a fit of rage, Alexander seized a spear and killed Cleitus on the spot. The army was stunned. Alexander himself fell into deep remorse, refusing food for days and mourning as if he had lost a brother. The incident revealed the growing rift between Alexander's imperial vision and the Old Guard's loyalty. By spring 327 BCE, Alexander besieged the Sogdian Rock, a sheer cliff fortress held by Ariomazes. The defenders mocked him from above, saying only winged men could take it. Alexander offered rewards to any who could scale the cliffs at night. 300 volunteers climbed in darkness with ropes and pitons, appearing at dawn above the garrison. The fortress surrendered in panic. Among the captives was Roxana's family. Her marriage had already sealed the region's submission. Alexander's policy in Central Asia blended conquest with integration. He appointed loyal satraps, often Persians or local nobles, and encouraged mixed marriages. He founded cities as garrisons and trade posts, spreading Greek culture while respecting local customs where possible. Yet the campaigns had taken a toll. Guerrilla warfare, harsh terrain, and endless fighting eroded morale. The Macedonian veterans were weary, and whispers of discontent grew. At age 29, Alexander had mastered the eastern satrapies, avenged Darius, and pushed his empire to the limits of the known world. But the greatest test of his leadership and the loyalty of his army lay ahead in India. Chapter 7: Invasion of India and the Hydaspes Battle, 327 to 325 BCE. In the spring of 327 BCE, after finally pacifying the restless regions of Bactria and Sogdia, Alexander III turned his eyes toward the fabled lands of India. For years he had heard tales of its vast wealth, mighty kings, and enormous armies of elephants. The world, as far as the Greeks knew it, ended somewhere beyond the Indus River, and Alexander was determined to reach that edge. The decision to press on was driven as much by his relentless ambition as by the need to secure his eastern frontier against any future threats. He divided his army for the crossing of the towering Hindu Kush Mountains. Alexander himself led the main column through the high and treacherous Kawak Pass, while Hephaestion took a second force through the lower, more accessible Kunar Valley. The passage was one of the most punishing ordeals of the entire campaign. Even in late spring, snow still clung to the peaks, and the freezing winds cut through cloaks and armor alike. Altitude sickness struck many. Pack animals slipped and plunged into ravines. Food supplies dwindled. Alexander marched on foot with his men, refusing any special treatment, and his presence alone kept the army moving forward. After 15 or 20 days of suffering, the survivors descended into the green valleys south of the mountains, reaching the Kabul River region at last. The first resistance came from the fierce mountain tribes of the region. The Aspasioi, dwelling in the rugged valleys of modern Kunar and Nuristan, fought with desperate courage. Alexander stormed their principal stronghold, personally leading the final assault up the steep slopes. An arrow struck him in the shoulder, piercing deep, but he pressed on until the position fell. The wound was serious, yet he refused to rest long. Next came the Assassini of the Swat Valley, whose capital, Massaga, was strongly fortified. After a determined siege, the city surrendered on terms. But when the 7,000 Greek mercenaries defending it tried to slip away at night, Alexander ordered their execution, viewing them as traitors to the Greek cause. Far more formidable were the rock fortresses that dotted the region. One after another, Ora and the famous Yornos fell to Alexander's ingenuity. The defenders of Yornos taunted him from their clifftop stronghold, claiming that not even Heracles had been able to take it. Alexander proved them wrong. Under cover of darkness, he sent 300 volunteers climbing the sheer rock face with ropes and ladders. At dawn they appeared above the garrison, and the fortress surrendered in panic. These victories opened the road into the Punjab and shattered the confidence of the local rulers. By late 327 BCE, Alexander crossed the Indus River at Hund, near modern Attock, the first time any Western army had reached this far into the Indian subcontinent. There he was met by Ampi, the king of Taxila, known to the Greeks as Taxiles. Ampi had already sent envoys to Alexander while he was still in Sogdia, offering submission in exchange for help against his powerful rival Porus, ruler of the lands between the Hydespes, Jalem, and Acessines, Chenab, rivers. Alexander accepted the alliance without hesitation. Taxila opened its gates in peace. Alexander entered the city in triumph and was awed by its wealth, its learned men, and its war elephants, beasts the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers. He held athletic contests and sacrifices in the Greek style, allowed Taxiles to continue ruling under Macedonian supervision, and used the city as a secure base for the next advance. Porus, however, refused to submit. He gathered a formidable army on the far bank of the Hydespes River and waited. Alexander faced a new kind of warfare. The monsoon season had begun, the river was swollen and swift, and Porus commanded 200 war elephants, 20,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and many chariots. The beasts alone were terrifying to the Macedonians, who had never fought anything like them. Alexander refused to be stopped by the river. He spread rumors that he would wait for the waters to subside, lulling Porus into complacency. Then, under cover of a violent thunderstorm, he secretly marched 17 miles upstream with his strike force of about 20,000 men. They crossed the swollen river at night on rafts and inflated hides, while Craterus remained opposite Porus's camp with the main army to deceive the Indian scouts. When dawn broke, Porus found Alexander's smaller but elite force already on his side of the river. The battle that followed was one of Alexander's greatest tactical triumphs. He personally led the companion cavalry in a sweeping charge that outflanked Porus's left wing. The phalanx advanced steadily into the center, their long sarissas terrifying the elephants. The great beasts, wounded and panicked, turned and trampled their own lines. Porus fought bravely atop his elephant until he was wounded and captured. After the victory, Alexander treated Porus with extraordinary honor. He returned his kingdom to him, added more territory, and gained a loyal ally. The casualties were heavy, perhaps 1,000 Macedonians dead, and 12 to 23,000 Indians, but the battle opened the way deeper into India. Alexander pressed on eastward, founding 2 cities on the site: Nicaea, Victory, where the battle took place, and Bucephala, named in memory of his beloved horse Bucephalus, who died of age and wounds shortly after the fight. The army marched through the Punjab, receiving submissions and founding more Alexandrias, but the cost of the campaign was mounting. The men were weary after 8 years of relentless war. The monsoon rains never ceased, and rumors grew of even larger armies waiting farther east. At last they reached the Hyphasis River, modern Bias, the easternmost point of Alexander's knowledge. Here the army finally refused to go on. The soldiers, soaked, exhausted, and homesick, laid down their weapons and demanded to return. Coenus, one of Alexander's oldest companions, spoke for them openly, pleading for an end to the endless march. Alexander tried to rally them with visions of glory and riches, but the men remained unmoved. For 2 days Alexander withdrew to his tent, brooding. He consulted the omens, which proved unfavorable. At last he accepted the inevitable. He ordered the construction of 12 colossal altars along the riverbank, each one larger than any siege engine his engineers had ever built, as a monument to mark the farthest reach of his conquests. Then he gave the order to turn back. The army rejoiced as they had never rejoiced before. They began the long journey home, unaware that the return would prove almost as deadly as the advance. Chapter 8. Return March, Consolidation and Final Years, 325 to 323 BCE. After the mutiny at the Hyphasis River in the summer of 326 BCE, Alexander III accepted that his men would go no farther east. The soldiers were exhausted, the monsoon rains relentless, and tales of the vast armies waiting in the Ganges plain had broken their spirit. Alexander, though inwardly furious, masked his disappointment. He erected 12 towering altars along the riverbank, each one larger than any siege tower his engineers had ever built, as a symbolic marker of the farthest point his empire had reached. Then he gave the order to turn back. The return journey began with a grand procession down the Hydaspes River. Alexander divided his forces for the long march home. Craterus took one column southwest through the mountains toward Carmania, while Alexander himself led the main body south along the rivers, accompanied by a newly built fleet under Nearchus. The river voyage was meant to be triumphant, but it quickly turned deadly. The Mali tribe, fierce warriors of the Punjab, refused to submit. In one of the most desperate fights of his life, Alexander stormed their stronghold, scaling the walls first and taking an arrow deep in the chest. For days he hovered near death, blood pouring from the wound as his surgeons worked frantically. The army believed he was already gone. Some began rioting in grief. When he finally recovered enough to show himself on a barge, the cheers echoed across the river. The Mali campaign cost thousands of lives on both sides. Alexander's reprisals were merciless, villages burned, populations massacred, until the region submitted. By late 326 BCE, he reached the confluence of the rivers and founded yet another Alexandria, modern Ut-Sharif in Pakistan, leaving settlers and garrisons behind. The fleet continued down the Indus toward the sea, while the army marched alongside, fighting off ambushes and enduring heat, disease, and dwindling supplies. The most infamous part of the return was the march through the Trojan Desert, modern Makran coast of Pakistan and Iran, in the summer of 325 BCE. Alexander chose this route deliberately, partly to punish the army for their refusal to go farther east, partly to prove it could be done, and partly because he wanted to link up with Nearchus's fleet. The desert was a nightmare. Water was scarce, temperatures soared, sandstorms blinded the men, and the army lost its way. Thousands died of thirst, exhaustion, and snakebite. Pack animals perished by the hundreds. Alexander himself walked on foot to share the suffering, refusing water when others had none. By the time they reached the fertile region of Carmania, perhaps three-quarters of the army that entered the desert had perished, one of the greatest losses of his entire campaign, not from battle but from nature itself. In Carmania, the survivors finally found relief. Alexander held lavish celebrations, pardoning debts, awarding crowns to officers, and staging athletic contests. Nearchus arrived by sea after a harrowing voyage along the coast, reporting that the fleet had survived against storms, starvation, and hostile tribes. The reunion was joyous. Alexander embraced Nearchus, weeping openly, believing him dead. By early 324 BCE, Alexander reached Susa, the old Persian administrative capital. Here he began the most ambitious phase of cultural fusion yet. In a massive ceremony called the Susa Weddings, he married Statira, daughter of Darius III, and Parasates, daughter of Artaxerxes III. At the same time, he arranged marriages for nearly 90 of his senior officers with Persian noblewomen, and encouraged 10,000 Macedonian soldiers to take Persian wives. The weddings were celebrated with Persian splendor, golden couches, incense, and banquets lasting days. Alexander also began training 30,000 Persian youths in Macedonian military discipline, the so-called epigoni, successors. When the veterans saw these Persian boys drilling with sarissas and speaking Greek, resentment boiled over. The crisis exploded at Opis in Babylonia in autumn 324 BCE. During a great assembly, Alexander announced that many Macedonian veterans would be sent home with rich gifts, while Persians would fill their places in the army. The veterans erupted in fury, shouting that Alexander had become Persian, that he preferred foreigners, that they were being discarded. Some threw down their weapons and demanded to be released immediately. Alexander reacted with fury. He ordered his guards to arrest the ringleaders, then executed 13 of them on the spot. The rest of the army fell silent in terror. For 2 days, Alexander shut himself away, refusing to see anyone. Then he emerged and invited the Persian leaders to a great reconciliation banquet. Macedonians and Persians sat together, shared wine from the same cup, and prayed for harmony between the races. Alexander wept openly, declaring that all men under his rule were brothers. The gesture worked. The veterans begged forgiveness, and Alexander granted their discharge with lavish bonuses. He organized a massive convoy to take them home to Macedonia, laden with wealth. In early 323 BCE, Alexander moved to Babylon to plan his next campaign, Arabia, then perhaps the western Mediterranean. He began massive engineering projects, draining marshes, building docks, and preparing a fleet. But his health, weakened by years of wounds, malaria, and exhaustion, was failing. In June 323 BCE, after a night of heavy drinking with his friend Medius, Alexander fell ill with a high fever. For 10 days he worsened, unable to speak in the final stages. His generals gathered around his bed, asking to whom he left the empire. With his last strength, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." He died on June 10 or 11, 323 BCE, at the age of 32. The greatest conqueror in history was gone, leaving an empire stretching from Greece to India, but without a clear successor. Word count: approximately 6,100 words. Sources include Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander, Book 6-7, Plutarch's Life of Alexander, Quintus Curtius Rufus, Books 9-10, Diodorus Siculus, Book 1718, Justin, and modern scholarship such as Robin Lane Fox's Alexander the Great, A.B. Bosworth's The Legacy of Alexander, Pierre Bryant's Alexander the Great and His Empire, and Waldemar Haeckel's The Marshals of Alexander's Empire. Chapter 9. Death, the Wars of the Diadochi and the Legacy, 323 BCE onward. In the early summer of 323 BCE, Alexander III returned to Babylon, the ancient city of Nebuchadnezzar, after years of ceaseless campaigning across 3 continents. He was only 32 years old, but the body that had once seemed invincible now bore the marks of every battle. The deep chest wound from the Mali arrow still pained him. Old malaria fevers came and went, and the constant strain of command had etched lines into his face. Yet his mind raced ahead. He planned a new expedition to conquer Arabia, then perhaps sail west to subdue Carthage and explore the outer ocean. He ordered the draining of the Babylonian marshes, the building of a great harbor and fleet, the construction of new roads, and the founding of more cities. The empire he had forged stretched from the Adriatic to the Indus, the largest the world had yet known, and Alexander was determined to make it greater still. One night in June, during a banquet with his friend Medius, Alexander drank deeply, something he had done more often in recent months. That night, a violent fever seized him. For 10 days he grew steadily worse, the sickness burning through him while he lay in the palace. His generals gathered around the bed, watching the man who had led them to the ends of the earth fade before their eyes. In the final hours, when he could no longer speak clearly, they asked the question that would echo through history: to whom did he leave the empire? With the last of his strength, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." Some say he added that the funeral games would be great, a grim prophecy of the wars to come. On June 10 or 11, 323 BCE, Alexander III died. The greatest conqueror in history was gone. The palace fell silent, then filled with cries of grief. The army wept openly. His body was embalmed in the Egyptian manner and placed in a golden coffin. For nearly 2 years it remained in Babylon while the men who had fought beside him argued over what to do with the empire he had left behind. The generals, the Diadochi or successors, met in the partition of Babylon in 323 BCE. They tried to preserve the dream of unity. Philip III or Hideous, Alexander's intellectually disabled half-brother, was named nominal king, with Alexander's infant son by Roxana, Alexander IV, as co-ruler. Perdiccas was appointed regent and guardian of the kings. The satrapies were divided among the senior commanders. Ptolemy received Egypt, Antigonus took Phrygia, Lysimachus held Thrace, Seleucus was given Babylonia, and others received lesser provinces. The arrangement was fragile from the start. These were ambitious men who had commanded armies for Alexander. None saw reason to obey one of their own for long. Within months, the cracks appeared. Perdiccas tried to hold the empire together by force, marching against Ptolemy in Egypt. Ptolemy, however, had already taken a decisive step. He intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege and brought the body to Egypt, burying it first in Memphis and later in the great city of Alexandria. Possession of the corpse became a powerful symbol of legitimacy. Perdiccas was murdered by his own officers in 321 BCE, and the wars of the Diadochi exploded into full fury. For the next 40 years, Alexander's generals and their sons fought bitterly over the pieces of his empire. Ptolemy, one Soter, founded the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, ruling from the magnificent city of Alexandria he built in Alexander's name. Seleucus, one Nicator, carved out the vast Seleucid Empire across Syria, Mesopotamia, and much of the East. Antigonus, one Monophthalmus, and his son Demetrius nearly reunited the empire, but were defeated at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. Lysimachus held Thrace and parts of Asia Minor for a time. Cassander seized Macedonia, murdered Alexander's mother Olympias, his wife Roxana, and his young son Alexander IV between 310 and 309 BCE, bringing the Argead royal line to a tragic end. By 281 BCE, after the Battle of Corupedium, the empire had settled into three major Hellenistic kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia. Smaller states emerged as well, including Greek kingdoms in Bactria and northern India, carrying Alexander's legacy farther east. Alexander's death closed the classical Greek era and opened the Hellenistic age. His empire did not survive him as a single state, but the cultural transformation he began endured for centuries. Greek language, art, philosophy, and cities spread across the Near East and beyond. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, home to the famous library and museum. Greek became the common tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Philosophy, science, sculpture, and architecture blended Greek idealism with Eastern realism and grandeur. Cities like Antioch, Seleucia, and Pergamon rivaled Athens in splendor. Alexander's legacy is vast and contradictory. To the Greeks, he was the ultimate hero, the man who carried Hellenic civilization to the ends of the earth. To the Persians and other conquered peoples, he was both destroyer and builder. He burned Persepolis yet respected local gods, married Eastern women, and appointed Persian nobles to high office. Modern historians debate his vision. Was he a dreamer of world unity, a ruthless conqueror driven by personal glory, or both? His policy of fusion, mixed marriages, multicultural armies, new cities, was revolutionary yet incomplete and resented by many of his own men. What cannot be denied is the scale of his achievement. In 13 years, he conquered an empire larger than any before, fought in every major battle himself, and never lost a campaign. He founded more than 70 cities, many of which still bear his name or trace their origins to his time. He opened new worlds to Greek exploration, trade, and culture, reshaping the ancient world forever. Alexander III died young, but his shadow stretched across centuries. The Hellenistic kingdoms carried his legacy forward until Rome eventually absorbed them. Even today, his name evokes the archetype of the conqueror, brilliant, restless, and ultimately tragic.